ready.
All right, so now we're going to hear about the call of Samuel and the prophecy, Samuel's first prophecy. The boy Samuel ministered to the Lord before Eli, and the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no widespread revelation. Excuse me. So, Samuel's ministering to the Lord before Eli. His work is to the Lord, but it's for Eli. We talked about that before. That's going to be important when we get to a little bit further down the Lord when it says that Samuel did not know the Lord yet. That's an interesting thing. We're going to need to tie that together. So he's working hard in his little linen ephod, and he's working hard doing all the things that he needs to do, but he's doing it before Eli and taking care of that. The word of the Lord was rare. The word that's used here can also be precious. So rare or precious. In that day, there was not widespread revelation. Now, we know that there was some revelation because in the previous chapter, who came to Eli? A man of God who said, "Thus says the Lord God." Well, that's definitely revelation. And so that's definitely a prophetic word being done. It doesn't mean there was nothing happening. It simply means that it was rare and precious. There wasn't a lot of it being out there. Remember, Samuel is the man who is bridging that gap between the last judge and the first prophet. Remember from our introduction chapter, Samuel puts into motion the entire chapter of prophets. And so now we're going to start seeing things pick up in a way that we haven't necessarily seen before. And it came to pass at that time when Eli was lying down in his place, and when his eyes had begun to grow so dim that he could not see. This is a real run-on sentence, Mom, which I think is why you were struggling a bit with it. It's a whole run-on sentence. Well, I'm going to just stop right there, even though there's not a period. So Eli is going to bed, lying down where he is. His eyes had begun to grow so dim that he could not see. Now, keep in mind he's 90, and there's not any health care for eyes in those days. And so pretty much everybody went blind. Cataracts, whatever happens when you age, they weren't able to protect the vision. So Eli, physically, his eyes are growing dim. However, I think it's really interesting that this becomes a point of interest to the Lord, that he brings this out for us. Because if you take it another step, it's also representational of the fact that Israel had become spiritually blind at this time. If not blind, very dim at this time. And so we discussed the fact that it was a little bit unusual for people to be righteous and godly. We talked about how Samuel's parents were an example of that, but that it wasn't the norm, that everything at the tabernacle had fallen apart and seemed, pretty gaudy and terrible. And we know that it was a very difficult time for the nation of Israel, and their spiritual walk had gotten very, very dim. And so I think it could be really, a case could really be made that this is an important thing to the Lord for that point also. It's not the only time in the Bible that physical blindness is used to represent spiritual blindness. God does that often. I included in your packet this time this one here with a couple that talks about ways where that happens exactly. Deuteronomy 28, it says, "You will grope at noon as the blind man gropes in darkness, and you will not prosper in your ways, and you shall be oppressed and robbed continually with none to save you." And so this has a picture of a spiritual a spiritual blindness, but talking about spiritual blindness. Look at Psalms. They do not know, nor do they understand. They walk about in darkness. And so this idea of not knowing is the same as blindness. Isaiah 59, "Therefore justice is far from us, and righteousness does not overtake us. We hope for light, but behold, darkness. For brightness, but we walk in gloom." Zephaniah, "I will bring distress on men so that they will walk like the blind. Because they have sinned against the Lord, and their blood will be poured out like dust." Okay, and so another example of how walking around like a spiritually blind person is the people who are spiritually blind. Matthew 15, let them alone. They are blind guides of the blind, and if the blind guides a blind man, both will fall into a pit. It's not, he's using physical blindness because we understand that. You wouldn't want two physically blind people leading each other. But in this point, in this case, it isn't a physically blind man. They are spiritually blind. In John 11, but if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. So there are more. This isn't all of them. Huh?
Laodicea.
There, exactly. The church in Laodicea. You could find another dozen if you want to go through. It's a common theme in the Bible that talks about physical blindness and spiritual blindness. So I think that could be part of what this is. So he could not see. And before the lamp of God went out in the tabernacle of the Lord, where the ark of God was. So the lamp of God went out in the tabernacle of the Lord where the ark of God was, is just that seven-pronged menorah that we've talked about before, the lampstand, whatever you want to call it, that it would be lit at night and it would burn all through the night until dusk the next day would occur and the oil would burn out. They would time it with the proper amount of oil so that it would burn all through the night. And while Samuel was lying down. Some people, in some commentaries that I read, really messed this up. They have Samuel lying inside the tabernacle next to the light. And some even had him in front of the holy place, as if that would be totally against anything that would go on at that time. Just like we read about in Ezekiel, where there were apartments for the priesthood, the same thing would be true at the tabernacle. There would be areas, call them apartments if you will, little segmented areas where the priest would sleep at night. And so Samuel would have that place where he would lie down, as Eli would have the place where he would lie down. Neither one of them would be in the Holy of Holies or anything like that. Although the commentaries do tend to go that direction.
It says in his place, not in God's place.
Yeah, exactly. But I think because it says where the ark was, and they just mix it all together. Verse 4, now the Lord called Samuel, and he answered, here I am. So the Lord called Samuel. What do you suppose that looked like? What do you suppose that sounded like? You're giving me the real indicators. So it's a voice, right? Is it in his heart or in his head or more than likely? It's more than likely an audible voice that says, what does he say with that?
It probably would scare Samuel, don't you imagine?
God, he thought it was Eli.
Well, he thinks it's Eli at this point. And so what does he pop up and say?
Here I am.
Here I am. Yeah. He's a little guy, remember, a youngster. So, here I am. So I was looking at that, and in your packet you'll see this page here that starts out with Abraham at the top. I have this because it is so interesting to me how many times that phrase is used. Abraham. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. And that's when he takes him to take Isaac out on the mountain. Go to Jacob. Then God spoke to Jacob in the vision of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here I am. Here I am. And he tells him, go on down into Egypt. Don't be afraid. Moses. So when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Here I am. He said, take off the sandals off your feet, for this is holy ground. Isaiah. Also I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And then I said, here am I. Here am I. Send me. Ananias, so this is the one who goes after, God sends to Saul when he's blinded on the road to Damascus. And so he sends Ananias to him. And it says, and there was a certain disciple at Damascus named Ananias, and to him the Lord said in a vision, Ananias. And he said, here I am. Here I am, Lord. And so he sends him to Saul. And finally, this last one, Jesus, first, this is in Hebrews, and it's speaking of Jesus, and it says, first he said, sacrifices and offerings, burnt offerings and sin offerings you did not desire, nor were you pleased with them. although they were offered in accordance with the law. And we've discussed that because we all know that the blood of animals never totally atoned for sin. It never forgave sin. It was just a covering over it. And so although that was what God asked, it was accordance with law. And then he said, and he's speaking of Jesus, "Here I am. I have come to do your will." So these are just some examples where that terminology is used. You notice that we're going to bump onto this in just a minute, but you notice that in a couple of these he uses the name twice, and that becomes important too. Nothing is in here that doesn't have a reason why it's in here. So this "here I am" is something that the most important leaders that we have in biblical history have oftentimes said to the Lord. So Samuel says, he's saying it to Eli at this point. That's who he thinks is doing that. And so he runs to Eli and says, "Here I am, for you called me." And he said, "I didn't call, lie down." So he went and laid down again. Verse 6, and the Lord called again and said, "Samuel." So Samuel arose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." And he said, "I did not call, my son, lie down again." So I'm trying to imagine an old man getting woke up by a little kid, and if he's saying it as lovingly as I just read it, or if he's saying it with a little harsher tone, not quite sure, but anyway.
And Samuel's got to be getting a little frustrated too.
Samuel's like, what is going on here? All right, so now we go to verse 7. Now Samuel did not know the Lord, nor was the word of the Lord yet revealed to him. Now this is interesting because we're hearing about all these things that Samuel is doing. We're hearing about the Lord revealing himself to Samuel here in this case, and yet he does not know the Lord. What does that mean? We talked about Eli's sons not knowing the Lord, and we said that meant what? That they were unregenerate, right? No heart of change, that they had not totally, we would call it, what would we call it, accepted the Lord? That's what we would say in today's vocabulary. They hadn't really made that thing. So there's no reason for us to assume that it's any different for Samuel at this point.
So he hasn't internalized God.
Exactly.
It has to be an external call.
Exactly. And so he is doing external work, just like Hophni and Phinehas were doing. He's doing external work, only he's doing it in a much better way. He's not doing it in a sinful way. But he has not yet had that moment that all of us have, that life-changing moment where you know everything is different, right? And so he hasn't yet had that yet, and the word of the Lord was not yet revealed to him. So he hasn't started his prophetic ministry yet at this point. He's just been working at the tabernacle. And the Lord called Samuel again the third time, and he arose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you did call me." And I want to put in there, you did too call me. But you did call me. So then Eli, who's older and wiser, perceives that the Lord has called the boy. Now, that's pretty shocking if you're Eli and you're the high priest. Mm-hmm. You're 90 years old, you're the high priest, you're the head guy, you're the head honcho, you wear the jeweled ephod, and God is calling Samuel, this young, Josephus says he's 12 when this happens. Mm-hmm. I can't tell you that for sure, but we know he was young. And so God is calling Samuel. I have to think, how did Eli feel? Why would God not call me? Yeah. You know, why would I not receive a word from the Lord? I'm guessing that would be it. Now, verse 9, therefore Eli said to Samuel, "Go lie down, and it shall be that if he calls you, you must say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant hears.'" So Samuel went and lied down in his place. So he's back in bed, and Eli's given him the good advice of saying, "Oh, it's God. Now, here's how you answer him." Because, of course, Samuel wouldn't have any idea. This is his first rodeo with God. He doesn't know yet how this all works. And so Eli is giving him that information. Now the Lord, verse 10, now the Lord came and stood and called as in other times. Here we go. Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel answered, just as he'd been taught, speak, for your servant hears. All right, so that's an interesting point when it says the Lord came and stood. So there are multiple ways that can be taken. Did the Shekinah glory show up in some manifestation? Did God present himself as something with legs? Was it an angel that had legs? Was it one of the pre-incarnate revelations of Jesus, being there? There's a lot of different ways that can be taken. Based on the Hebrew word for stood, one of the ways that I think it really has a tendency to make the most sense to me, although it could be any of those others, and so, is that when it says that he stood, it means that he stayed in one place. So if the voice sounded like it was coming from various areas, if it stands in one place, would make it seem like it's coming from a specific area. So if I'm hearing that voice throughout all of my house, that's one thing. But if I hear it from this room, it's as if the Lord is standing here facing me. So whether there was an actual Lord standing there, or however you want to take that, it changes. It ratchets up just a little bit in his call. And he also uses the double names. In your packet, you'll see again that I gave you this information to look at this week. The different times that is. We've talked about this before. We talked about it with Moses when we were in Exodus. So there's Abraham, there's Jacob, Moses, Samuel, Martha, Simon, Saul, Lord, Eloi, Jerusalem. Those are some examples of the double name calling. God calls twice to get people's attentions because what he is about to share is monumentous. When he calls twice in the Bible, each occasion immediately was elevated to one of the great biblical important events for that person or that city. So you never see him use the name twice in the Bible that something important doesn't happen. And so it's interesting to me that it's the time when he says, Samuel, that Samuel is ready to receive what it is that the Lord has, because now Samuel's life is going to change. Samuel officially becomes the prophet. The Lord said to Samuel, behold, I will do something in Israel at which both ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. Isn't that funny? I thought that was so funny this week, until I realized that's not the only place where that's used. In 2 Kings 21 and in Jeremiah 19, God says both times, look at the first one, 2 Kings 21, says, therefore thus says the Lord God of Israel, behold, I am bringing such calamity upon Jerusalem and Judah that whoever hears of it, both of his ears will tingle. Go down to Jeremiah 19. It's talking about the same event, by the way, when it says, thus says the Lord God of hosts, the God of Israel, behold, I will bring such a catastrophe on this place that whoever hears of it, his ears will tingle. So the interesting thing to me in this is that in all three cases, including our case here in Samuel, who's saying that? God. That's his terminology. When I first heard that, the first place I went to was maybe the writer of this, that was something that was a common phrase they used. I don't know. But it appears that all three times God uses that tingling.
Which is a weak word in English.
Tingling, yeah. So it's a jarring. See this lady's face? This lady's face, she's not happy. Because what she's hearing is disturbing her ears a great deal. And that's what the tingling is supposed to represent here, is that it's going to be something that's jarring to hear and understand. And so he says that people who hear this, it's going to tingle. There's a coming calamity that's going to happen. And here's what it is in verse 12. In that day that the ears are going to tingle, I will perform, in that day when the coming calamity comes, actually, I will perform against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. Now, does he already know what that is?
Eli to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the man of God just told him what that was. Remember, we just read that whole horrible judgment, and then it said your sons are going to die just as a sign to you that everything that I've told you, your house, your lineage, everything is going to be destroyed, and no one's going to live to a ripe old age and all that. So he's saying, I am going to, from beginning to end, I am reconfirming the prophetic word that Eli heard. Only this time Eli's not hearing it. It's coming to Samuel, right? For I have told him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knows. Underline that, because that's the important part. This didn't come as a surprise. Eli wasn't blindsided. He knew. Because earlier in chapter 2, he says, I've been hearing the reports from the people about all the horrible things you've been doing. That tells you what? The people were so upset, they were coming to Eli and saying, your sons are worthless. Your sons are horrible. So it was bad enough for that to happen. And so Eli had known, not just for a day or two, he hadn't just heard it when he went to his sons. Evidently, this had been an ongoing issue. So that which he knows is an important thing, because his sons made themselves vile, and he did not restrain them. What would Eli have been far better off if he had done?
Told them what they were doing.
Okay, told them, disciplined them. Go back in the Old Testament, what would the discipline have been? Stone them. What a horrible thing to have to do. But Eli would have been far better off if he would have made that example of his sons, so that the rest of Israel would see that and say, God doesn't mess around with that.
It would have protected the whole line.
The whole line. Exactly. And so it's just amazing to me. Look, think back on Aaron, when Nadab and Abihu, when they brought in the fire, the strange fire. What happened? God slays them right there. And what does he tell Aaron? Don't even pay any attention. Just ignore what's going on. Let them take the bodies off and deal with all of that right now. And boy, if you stop and think about that, what kind of a lesson was that for the people?
Huge. Yeah.
To look at that. It's life-changing. And so Eli had the opportunity to make that kind of a life-changing lesson for the spiritually dim nation of Israel, and he chose not to do it. So when you see how harsh this judgment is, remember all of those details. They're critically important. And so therefore, where are we? 14. And therefore I have sworn to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or by offering forever. And all that's saying is that he's at the point of no return. There's no sacrifice left for this. It's done. It's going to be, this will be done from the beginning to the end. So, verse 15, Samuel lay down until the morning. Do you think he slept? I kind of think maybe not. And he lay down until morning, and then he goes and opens the doors of the house of the Lord. That seems to be what his job was. Opening up the gates and opening up the different areas. That was what he did. And Samuel was afraid to tell Eli the vision. Why?
His sons were going to get killed.
He already knew that, didn't he?
Yes, uh-huh.
Did he know his sons were going to be killed?
Yes.
He already knew that.
Told.
So why would you think he was afraid?
He didn't want to hurt Eli, maybe.
This is his mentor.
Okay, father figure, isn't
Yeah,
it?
that's he didn't want to make him upset.
He doesn't want to be the one to have to bring that news to Eli. I'm guessing, yeah, he loved him, and he didn't want to have to tell him that. And so Eli.
Well, you always hate to tell someone you love bad news.
Well, most people do. There are those that love it, but most people do. So Eli calls to Samuel. So Samuel doesn't go to Eli. Eli calls to Samuel. And he says, Samuel, my son. And once again, he uses this little phrase, here I am, here am I. And he said, what is the word that the Lord spoke to you? You know Eli had to be just dying of curiosity all night long. wondering what was going on with Samuel. Please do not hide it from me. God do so to you and more also, if you hide anything from me of all the things that he has said to you. I think this speaks well of Eli, because he wants to know what the Lord said, and he's already heard the worst of it. So maybe he's wondering if there's even worse coming. But there's a part of me that thinks that perhaps Eli desires to hear the word of the Lord for him. He still had that in him. And Samuel tells him everything and hid nothing from him. So he tells him everything that he just heard there. And he says, it is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. Wow. That takes a lot. Let him do what seems good to him. That's kind of like that prayer that we sometimes pray with, whatever it takes, Lord.
Yeah.
Whatever it takes.
Not an easy prayer.
Well, it's not an easy prayer, and I sometimes think, wow, if we are called on the carpet for that, are we okay with it? Because I know sometimes I've said, boy, whatever it takes, but then in my heart of hearts I've gone, but not that. not that one, because that's just awful. So not that. But anything else that it takes. Well, and then there's that other, not that other thing too. But all the rest of it, whatever it takes. It's hard, isn't it?
Yes.
And so Eli's heard the worst of it. He's heard about his 2 sons. He's heard what's going on with all of that. And he says, it's the Lord. It's God. It's Jehovah. Whatever it takes, what seems good to him. So Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. That's a terminology that means everything that Samuel said was fulfilled. Remember, how do you know a prophet is a true prophet? His word, it's fulfilled. It comes true. How do you know you're a false prophet? It doesn't come true. If it doesn't come true, you're a false prophet. It's pretty easy, right? And so he let none of the words fall to the ground just means everything that Samuel begins to speak becomes fulfilled. God is establishing him much like he did Ezekiel. God is establishing him as a true prophet. And if he is a young man at this time, he's maybe a young teenager at this time. I mean, there's a lot of responsibility falling on him. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel had been established as a prophet of the Lord, or authenticated as a prophet of the Lord. And so that terminology, Dan to Beersheba, would be like us saying from San Francisco to New York City, from end to end, because that's the most northerly city and the most southerly city. It encompasses all of it. So Samuel's reputation is getting out there. Who does that in a time where there's no internet and there's no God is working, isn't he? God is taking this young boy, rapidly spreading him his reputation, fulfilling prophetic word. We don't know exactly what Samuel is saying at this time. Whatever it is that he's saying, it's important, and all of the tribes of Israel are interested in it. The tribes of Israel are spiritually weak. The word of the Lord has been rare and precious. Put yourself in their place. That's why I'm putting all this together. So that you can see when they're hearing this, how do you think they feel knowing that God is working through Samuel again? That's a pretty exciting thing, isn't it? And so they are going to get pretty excited down the road, and it's going to cause them to jump ahead of the Lord. As they get very excited about the fact that Samuel is doing something good, and as we normally do, they're just going to take it and they're going to run with it. So the last verse 21, then the Lord appeared again in Shiloh. Why is he in Shiloh?
Tabernacle.
Tabernacle is there, and the
Tabernacle,
priesthood is there, and all the important events that are happening are there. For the Lord revealed himself to Samuel in Shiloh. Okay, so that's where he came to him, but here's an important one. By what? The word of the Lord. So that's a critically important one. All right, so just really quickly, let me tell you what's in your packet so that you can read it. Verse 20, yeah, you can turn that off. Thank you. Exodus 29 is